And the second one, number 5, 2018 test number 5, we're given f of x is e to the x times cosine of x. First part, we want to find the average rate of change. On 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to pi. This is the slope of the secant line. So whatever that looks like, we want the average rate of change. That's the slope from the endpoints. So we're going to have f of pi minus f of 0 over pi minus 0, average rate of change. Evaluating, we have e to the pi cosine of pi minus e to the 0 cosine 0 all over pi. Cosine of pi, that's -1. Cosine of 0 is 1. E to the 0 is 1. So this gets us negative e to the pi minus 1 all over pi. Average rate of change. B, slope of the tangent line, that's the derivative, at 3 pi over 2. So we're given f of x is e to the x cos x. F prime of x, product rule, is going to be e to the x cos x, derivative of e times a second, plus derivative of cosine, minus e to the x sine x. Evaluating f prime of 3 pi over 2, we have e to the 3 pi over 2 cosine 3 pi over 2 minus e to the 3 pi over 2 sine 3 pi over 2. Cosine 3 pi over 2 is 0, the whole thing is 0. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is -1, so we have negative e to the 3 pi over 2 times -1. Slope of the tangent line is therefore positive e to the 3 pi over 2. Part C, we want to find the absolute minimum of f on the interval 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 2 pi. Absolute minimum, that's the first derivative. So we're going to go through the first derivative test. So we already have f prime is equal to e to the x cos x minus e to the x sine x. I'm going to factor this. So this is e to the x, that's cosine x minus sine x. We want when is this equal to 0. By factoring, separating this out, e to the x is never equal to 0, so I'm not going to have any zeros from that. Cos x minus sine x equals 0. When x is pi over 4, or when x is 5 pi over 4. That's quadrant 1, that's quadrant 3. So we're going to test our values here. Those are zeros for the first derivative. That means we're going to have a horizontal tangent point. Either that's going to be a maximum or a minimum. Going in, I'm going to use the sign chart. Now we have to include 0. We've got to include 2 pi. So pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. I'm going to substitute these values, or if we go into the sign chart, e to the x is always positive. So that's positive, I don't care. If I pick anything in between 0 and pi over 4, cosine is greater than sine. Thinking about the unit circle, cosine is greater than sine from 0 to pi over 4. So anything in there is positive. From pi over 4 to 5 pi over 4, cosine is always less than sine. Is that right? Cosine is always less than sine. Thinking pi over 2 to 5 pi over 4, cosine is negative, and that's going to be negative as well. So we're always negative. From 5 pi over 4 to 2 pi, we're back to being positive. So we want to find the absolute minimum. An absolute minimum is going to happen when we've got a sign change going from positive to negative. So if we have something, it's going to be here. But we could also have something at the endpoint, thinking our first derivative is positive, so we're increasing here. We're decreasing here. I don't know if we're decreasing more, and then we're going and increasing again. So this could be our absolute minimum. This could be our absolute minimum. We want to find f of 0. Plugging in, that's e to the 0, cosine of 0. That gets us 1. If we've got f of 5 pi over 4, that's e to the 5 pi over 4. That's greater than 1. And then cosine 5 pi over 4. So this is e to the 5 pi over 4. That's negative root 2 over 2. That's definitely less than 1. So x equals 5 pi over 4. F of 5 pi over 4, whatever that comes out to be, negative root 2 over 2 e to the 5 pi over 4 is our absolute minimum. And part D. Given that graph in there, haven't read it yet. We're given g of pi over 2 equals 0. We have the graph of g prime given. We want to find the limit as x approaches pi over 2 of f of x over g of x. Now, f of x, this is e to the pi over 2, let's just think, times cosine pi over 2. That gives us 0. Direct substitution, if we plug in pi over 2 to g, that gives us 0. So we've got 0 over 0. That's L'Hopital's rule. So we really want to find the limit as x approaches pi over 2 f prime of x over g prime of x. F prime of x, we know, is e to the x cosine x minus sine x over g prime of the x. If we look at the graph, that gives us a value g prime of pi over 2. That's going to give us 2. Plugging in pi over 2, that's 0. Plugging in pi over 2 gives us 1. Pi over 2, so we have negative 1 times e to the pi over 2 over 2. So we have negative e to the pi over 2 over 2. There's the value of our limit.